The wind in the Arizona-New Mexico high country did not ask permission. It scoured the land without pity, taking what it wanted from the cracked earth and giving nothing back but the grit it threw in your teeth. This was Dust Haven, a town clinging to a patch of thirsty ground, waiting on a railroad spur that promised everything and delivered only more dust for now. The year was creeping toward the end of the 1880s, and the drought had a grip so tight the cacti themselves looked tired. Eliza Hart knew the sound of that wind. It was the only constant companion she had. At 29 years old, a widow with no children, she was an item discussed and dismissed. Too old, the whispers in the pews on Sunday said. Too old for a new start. Too old to be anything but a fixture, like the worn brass bell above the mercantile door. She was ringing up Mr. Hemlock's profits, such as they were. When the bell jangled, Eliza kept her eyes on the ledger, her fingers nimble on the keys of the new cash register. A shadow fell across the counter, blocking the sliver of dusty light from the front window. It was not a town shadow. It was bigger, and it smelled of horse and distance, not of tonic and tobacco. She looked up. Caleb Boone. He was a man carved from the same hard land as the mesas, all angles and quiet tension. About 35. Folks guessed, though his eyes held a history that made age irrelevant. He was a rancher, they said, though the horses he ran were half wild, and his methods were not the town's. He had been a cavalry scout, and the faint, silvery scar that ran from his left temple into his hairline spoke of a past he never did. He placed a heavy sack of flour and 3 tins of peaches on the counter. He did not speak, just nodded. "Mr. Boone," Eliza said, her voice clear and level. It was the same voice she used for everyone, from Jed Merrick, who owned the bank and half the county, to the preacher's wife, who pitied her so loudly. Caleb Boone's gaze met hers. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a storm, a deep, unsettled gray. He gave a short, acknowledging dip of his chin. He watched her hands as she tallied the sum, his stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy that usually filled the store. The bell jangled again. This time, the silence in the store thickened, turning sour. Chayton Greyhawk stood in the doorway, framed against the blinding white street. He was Mescalero Apache, a warrior by the set of his shoulders and a scout by the piercing intelligence in his eyes. He was Caleb Boone's friend, which made him an enemy to most of Dust Haven. He wore buckskin trousers and a linen shirt that had seen better days, but he carried himself with a fluid grace the stiff-collared townsmen lacked. He did not enter fully, just leaned against the jamb, his gaze sweeping the store's interior. He was watching for threats, a habit ingrained. "Chayton," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. He did not turn. Chayton nodded, his eyes lingering for a second on Eliza before dismissing her as part of the building. He was Caleb's shadow, and the town hated them both for it, Boone for his refusal to conform, and Greyhawk for his refusal to disappear. Eliza finished the tally. "That will be $1.40. Caleb pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket and laid the coins on the wood, one by one. His movements were deliberate, economical. As his fingers brushed the counter, Eliza saw the scarred knuckles, the ingrained dirt that no amount of lye soap would ever scrub clean. He gathered his goods. He and Chayton left as they had come, in a pool of silence that the town's gossip immediately rushed to fill. "Ought to be a law," muttered Mr. Hemlock from the back, where he was pretending to sort invoices. "Letting that Apache walk right in here, bad for business." Eliza said nothing. Her business was the ledger, and the ledger was precise. People were not. Dust Haven lived on a currency of whispers. It was how fortunes were lost and matches were made. A girl of 17 was ripe for marriage. A girl of 20 was fading. Eliza, at 29, was a ghost at the feast, a walking reminder of failure. Not her failure, of course. Her husband, Tom, had been a good man, a kind man, who had the bad manners to be gored by a steer 2 years into their marriage. leaving her with his name and nothing else. Now, the town was run by men like Jed Merrick. He was a portly man who dressed in suits too heavy for the climate, as if he could sweat his importance into the air. He owned the bank, which held the notes on nearly every ranch and shop, including Hemlock's Mercantile. He was the chairman of the town council, and he was maneuvering to buy up water rights, knowing the railroad would make him a king. He had 2 unmarried daughters, both plump and dull, and it was widely understood they would be married off to secure land, not love. Eliza was counting the day's meager receipts when Mr. Hemlock approached. He was a small man, perpetually smelling of pipe smoke and fear. "Miss Hart," he began, cleaning his spectacles on his apron. "A moment, if you please. In the office." Eliza's spine stiffened. She had been in that office only once before, a week ago. She had gone to him quietly, privately, to show him the discrepancies in the books. Mr. Sipes, the town treasurer who also managed Hemlock's accounts, had been skimming, a few cents here, $1 there, all carefully hidden. Sipes was Jed Merrick's creature, a weasel who did the banker's bidding. Eliza had thought she was doing the right thing. Mr. Hemlock had turned pale and shooed her out, promising to look into it. Now, his face was a mask of practiced regret. She followed him into the tiny, cramped office, the air thick with the smell of stale paper. "Eliza," he started, which was worse. He never used her first name. "This is a difficult thing, a very difficult thing." "What is it, Mr. Hemlock?" He would not meet her eyes. He fiddled with a letter opener. "There have been complaints. Talk." Eliza's hands, clasped in front of her, were perfectly still. "About your manner, Eliza, with the customers." He cleared his throat. A small, wet sound. "A certain familiarity. It is not becoming for a woman in your position, a widow alone." The blood drained from Eliza's face, leaving a cold, clear rage. She knew exactly which customer he meant. Mr. Sipes had been in 3 days ago, his eyes too bold, his hand brushing her arm as she passed him his change. She had fixed him with a look of such cold disinterest that he had scurried away, his face mottled red. "What talk? Mr. Hemlock, be specific." "It is not for me to say," he squeaked, finally looking up, his eyes watery with self-pity. "But Mr. Merrick himself expressed concern. He feels the store's reputation is at stake. He holds the note on this building, you understand." "I understand," Eliza said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I understand that I showed you proof, mister. Sipes is stealing from you, and now I am being dismissed because Mr. Sipes is Mr. Merrick's man." "It is not like that," Hemlock protested, sweating now. "It is about propriety, a single woman. Too familiar, that is the story. Eliza, and it is the one that sticks." The injustice of it was a physical thing, a hot, bitter bile rising in her throat. She had done nothing wrong. She had been honest. She had been diligent. And she was being cast out because a thief had friends in high places. And because she was a woman of 29 with no man to speak for her. "So I am fired." It was not a question. "I am afraid so, Miss Hart, for the good of the establishment." He held out a small envelope. "A week's wages. For your trouble." Eliza looked at the envelope. She looked at the weak, trembling man who held it. Then she turned, without a word, and walked out of the office. She untied the strings of her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter next to the register. She did not look at Mr. Hemlock, who had followed her out, wringing his hands. She walked to the door, her back straight, her head held high. The brass bell jangled, a mocking little sound. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, into the searing late afternoon sun. The wind hit her immediately, whipping her skirts and throwing fine, stinging dust into her face. Across the street, Two women from the church sewing circle stopped talking and turned to stare, their faces a mixture of pity and predatory interest. Eliza's heart pulled her shawl tighter. She was 29 years old. She was a widow. She was respectable. And she had just been fired for being too familiar. The lie was already halfway across town, carried on the same wind that scoured the plains. She set her chin and began the long, hot walk to her rented room, her future as barren and exposed as the land stretching out before her. The news of Eliza's dismissal traveled faster than a prairie fire. By the time she had locked the door to her small rented room above the bakery, the story had already changed. It was no longer about ledgers and a thief. It was about a desperate widow, a certain familiarity, and the righteous, if reluctant, actions of a concerned employer. The women she had sat with in church for 3 years now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. For 2 days, Eliza did not leave. She had a small amount of savings, enough for perhaps 2 more weeks of rent, not enough for a future. She scrubbed her floorboards, patched her good black skirt, and read the same page of her father's Bible 20 times, the words refusing to settle. She was in a box, and the walls were the opinions of Dusthaven. On the 3rd evening, there was a knock. It was not a friendly knock. It was an official one. It was Mr. Sipes himself, the treasurer, looking pleased and puffed up. "Miss Hart," he said, not meeting her eye, but grinning at a point past her shoulder. "A summons from the town council." He handed her not a summons, but a thick, cream-colored invitation card. "Mr. Jed Merrick requests the pleasure of your company. This evening, 8 o'clock sharp, the town hall." Eliza looked at the card. "The Dusthaven Prosperity Gala," she read, her voice flat. "I was not aware there was one." "A new initiative," Sipes said, rocking on his heels, "to benefit the town, and, those less fortunate, a fundraiser. Mr. Merrick felt strongly that all of the town's unmarried ladies should be represented." His eyes flickered over her. "Insolent. Attendance is, of course, vital for community spirit. 8 o'clock. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mockery, and left. Eliza knew a threat when she heard one. Community spirit was the club they used to beat anyone who stepped out of line. Less fortunate was the label they had just pinned to her chest. To refuse would be seen as an admission of guilt, a defiant snub to Merrick himself. It would finish her in this territory. She looked at her one good dress, the dark wool she wore on Sundays. It was modest, clean, and hopelessly out of fashion. She put it on, brushed her hair until her scalp ached, and locked her door behind her. The town hall was ablaze with oil lamps. The heat and the smell of whale oil thick in the air. The piano was being pounded by the preacher's wife, a tune that was cheerful to the point of violence. The hall was packed. Merrick stood near the front, beaming, his waistcoat straining, accepting compliments on his generosity. Eliza slipped in near the back, intending to be a shadow. But as soon as she entered, the chatter dimmed. A wave of silence followed her as she found a spot against the wall. Heads turning, whispers rising behind fans and gloved hands. She was the entertainment before the entertainment had even begun. She saw Mr. Hemlock, who looked away, his face pale. She saw the women from the sewing circle, their eyes like bright, hard buttons. She stood for what felt like an hour, a statue of propriety, her hands clasped, her gaze fixed on a crack in the far wall. Finally, Merrick climbed the small stage, holding his hands up for quiet. "Friends, neighbors, welcome." His voice was oily with false fellowship. "Welcome to the first, and I promise you, annual Dusthaven Prosperity Gala, a night for community, a night for charity." He droned on about the railroad, about the future, about the civic duty that bound them all. Then his tone shifted, becoming pious, almost sorrowful. "But our great town is not just about railroads and commerce. It is about family. It is about decency. and it is our Christian duty." He looked toward the preacher, who nodded gravely. "To care for those in a delicate position, to provide stability. Tonight, our fundraiser takes a very special form. We are here to secure the futures of those gentlewomen who find themselves without the protection of a husband." A cold, sick dread washed over Eliza. This was not a gala. This was a cattle auction. "We have several, opportunities for the fine, upstanding bachelors of Dusthaven," Merrick continued, pulling a card from his pocket. "To make a match, to build a home, and to contribute to the town's moral fiber." A nervous titter ran through the crowd. This was new and cruel, and therefore fascinating. "And we shall begin," Merrick said, his eyes finding her, "with a woman we all know, a woman of, maturity and experience, a woman who has served our community diligently, Miss Eliza Hart." The name echoed in the hot, silent room. All eyes turned to her. She felt as if she had been stripped naked. She could not move, could not breathe. Mr. Sipes, who had taken the position of auctioneer beside Merrick, stepped forward. "Now, gentlemen," Sipes called out, his voice reedy, "here is a fine opportunity, a woman of 29 years. A few gasps and a low, cruel laugh from the back. "She knows her letters and can keep a ledger," Sipes continued, warming to his task, feeding on her humiliation. "A fine housekeeper. I am told perhaps a trifle too old for a full nursery." He winked at the crowd. "But not without her uses. What man will start the bidding for this? Seasoned bride, the donation for her dowry chest, who will start at $50. The crowd erupted in laughter. It was a joke, a mean, terrible joke, and she was the punchline. Eliza stood, frozen, the blood roaring in her ears. She would not cry. She would not faint. She would not look down. Her chin was high, her eyes staring straight ahead, seeing nothing but the blur of faces that despised her for her age, her poverty, her refusal to be invisible. $50, Sipes taunted. "Surely one man in this town needs a good, quiet housekeeper, 40-30. The back doors of the town hall slammed open, crashing against the walls. The laughter died instantly. Caleb Boone stood in the entryway, flanked by the silent, imposing shadow of Chayton Greyhawk. They were not dressed for a party. They were dressed for the range, covered in dust, and they had brought the cold night air in with them. The crowd parted, a sea of whispers and fear. As Caleb walked down the center aisle, he did not look at anyone but the men on the stage. His face was granite, and his eyes, that stormy gray, were narrowed to slits. "What is this?" Caleb's voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. Merrick, flustered, regained his composure. "Mr. Boone, this is a private, civic function. You are not welcome here. You are disturbing the peace." "I am disturbing this," Caleb said, gesturing to the room. To Eliza. "What is the price on the woman?" "Now see here," Sipes squeaked. "This is a charitable donation for a dowry." "I heard you," Caleb said. "You said she was too old for a full nursery. You're selling her. So, I am asking the price." He walked directly to the stage, his spurs ringing on the floorboards, and looked up at Merrick. "You are a banker. Merrick, you only understand one thing." Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the stage, where it landed with a heavy, metallic thud. "There is $100 in gold," Caleb said, his voice resonating in the dead quiet. "That buys the town's peace for the night, the fine for my disturbance." He then turned, his gaze sweeping the stunned crowd. "But people," he said, his voice dropping, "are not property, not in this territory. You will not buy them. You will not sell them. Not for land, not for water, and not for charity." He faced Merrick again. "The auction is over." Merrick's face was purple with rage. "You cannot. The council will. You will be fined, arrested." "I just paid my fine," Caleb said. He turned and walked the last few steps to where Eliza stood, still frozen against the wall. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. The entire town was holding its breath. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice rough, but stripped of all mockery. "These men are finished with you." He held out his hand, palm up. "Are you coming?" Eliza looked at his hand. It was the hand she had seen in the store, scarred and calloused. It was not a gentle hand, but it was an honest one. She looked at the faces in the crowd, twisted with hatred and thwarted curiosity. She looked at Merrick, who looked like he was about to have a stroke. If she stayed, she was finished. If she left, she was ruined in a different, more permanent way. She would be Caleb Boone's woman, an outcast tied to an outcast. He had said, "Are you coming?" A question, a choice. She slowly, deliberately, lifted her hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. He did not yank her. He did not possess her. He simply turned, and with her hand in his, he led her back down the aisle. The silence was so complete that the only sound was the jingle of his spurs and the rustle of her skirt. They walked past the open-mouthed preacher, past the furious, red-faced banker, past the staring, silent women. As they reached the door, Chayton Greyhawk, who had been watching the room, stepped aside to let them pass. He gave Caleb a barely perceptible nod. Then his eyes flickered to the shadows of the alley. A scout's instincts already on alert. Caleb pushed the door open, and the cold, clean night air hit Eliza's face. They stepped out onto the dark boardwalk, and the doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the light and the hate. Eliza immediately pulled her hand from his. She was shaking, a violent, bone-deep tremor of reaction. "I did not ask you to do that," she said, her voice a low, furious whisper. She would not, could not, cry. "I know," Caleb said, his back to her, looking out at the dark, empty street. "You have destroyed me," she said, the words tearing out of her. "Whatever reputation I had left, you have just burned it to the ground. They will say I am your woman." He turned to face her. In the faint moonlight, the scar on his temple was a silver thread. "What they were saying in there," he said, his voice flat, "was that you were for sale? That you were worth less than a good horse because you are 29. They were laughing at you." "I am aware of what they were saying," she retorted, shame and anger warring within her. "I saved your freedom, Miss Hart, not your reputation," he said, his words stark. "Your reputation was dead the minute Sipes opened his mouth. All I did was stop them from picking at the bones." The harsh truth of it silenced her. He was right. She had been a spectacle, a thing to be pitied and sold. He had not saved her honor. He had only affirmed her humanity. A shadow detached itself from the alley wall. Chayton Greyhawk appeared beside them as if summoned from the earth itself. He ignored Eliza, his focus entirely on Caleb. "Merrick is not the only problem," Chayton said, his voice low and urgent. The whispers in the saloon were not about the gala. He is sent for the Tlailuish, the Black-Tooth Riders. Caleb's head snapped toward him. The social violation in the hall was instantly dwarfed by a physical threat. "The Black-Tooth Riders, they are guns for hire. Why?" "Water," Chayton said, the one word hanging heavy in the dry air. "Merrick wants your ranch. Caleb, he wants the spring. The riders are here to make sure he gets it. This night, this was just Merrick puffing himself up. The real trouble is coming." Caleb was still for a long moment, processing the information. He looked from Chayton's grim face, down the dark, dusty street, and then, finally, at Eliza. She stood there, a woman with no job, no reputation, and nowhere to go, who had just been publicly claimed by one outcast and targeted by the town's most powerful man. "He will not stop," Caleb said, his voice almost a whisper, as if to himself. "This was not the end of it, Miss Hart. This just began." Caleb Boone's words hung in the air, as dry and cold as the night wind. "The real trouble is coming." Eliza looked from his grim, set face to Chayton Greyhawk, whose stillness was that of a predator. She was a woman balanced on a knife edge. Behind her lay the town hall, a pit of social vipers who had just tried to sell her. In front of her stood two outcasts, one of whom had just bought her, or, at least, bought her humiliation. And now, there was word of hired guns. "What does this have to do with me?" Eliza asked, her voice finally returning, though it was strained. "My situation is a town matter. This," she gestured vaguely toward Chayton, "is about your ranch." "Merrick just tied them together, Miss Hart," Caleb said, his gaze sharp. "He used you to make a show of his power. Now he knows I have interfered. He will not see two separate problems. He will see one, me. And now, you are with me." "I am not with you," she retorted, the words sharper than she intended. "I am standing on a boardwalk, ruined because you made a spectacle." "You are standing here," Chayton said, his voice soft, almost toneless. "And the Blacktooth Riders are in the saloon. They are not men who drink quietly. They are here for a reason, Merrick's reason." Caleb looked down the dark street, toward the flickering light of the saloon, then at her rented room above the bakery. "You cannot go back there, Sipes and his friends. They will not let this rest. And if the Riders know Merrick sees you as an associate of mine—" He did not need to finish. A cold, practical fear, different from the hot shame of the gala, settled over Eliza. She had seen men like the Blacktooth Riders before, passing through. They were the wolves that came down when the law was weak. "I have my room. I will lock my door," she said, her own words sounding thin and foolish. "A lock will not stop them," Caleb said. "I have a wagon at the livery. It is taking supplies to the ranch. It leaves before dawn. You will be on it. You are ordering me. I am giving you the only choice you have left that ends with you breathing free air tomorrow. Miss Hart." He took a step back, his face unreadable in the dark. "Pack what you can carry in one hand. Be at the South Livery Gate in 2 hours, before the moon sets." He did not wait for an answer. He and Chayton turned, melting back into the shadows they seemed to belong to, leaving her alone on the boardwalk, the echo of the town hall's ugly laughter still in her ears. She was being managed, moved, and commanded. She hated it. She hated him for it. But the image of the Blacktooth Riders, their name like a curse, was more potent than her pride. She hurried to her room, her mind a turmoil of fury and fear. She packed her few serviceable clothes, her mother's Bible, and the small tin of money she had saved. She had exactly $1.25. 2 hours later, the town was a graveyard. The moon was a sliver, casting long, nervous shadows. Eliza slipped through the alleyways, her small carpet bag clutched in her hand. The South Livery was dark, but as she approached, the gate creaked open. A small, sturdy buckboard stood ready, hitched to 2 mules. A young livery hand she did not recognize was checking the harness, his movements jerky. Caleb Boone's horse and Chayton's pinto were tethered nearby. The 2 men were in the shadows. "Get in," Caleb said, his voice a low command. He helped her onto the hard wooden seat, his grip on her elbow impersonal and strong. "Keep this blanket over you. It is cold." He and Chayton mounted. The livery hand took the reins, and with a quiet, "Yeah," the buckboard lurched forward, its wheels grinding softly in the thick dust. They moved at a walking pace until they cleared the last silent house. Then the driver urged the mules into a trot. They took the south trail. a rutted track that wound away from the main road, deeper into the high, broken country that led toward Boone's ranch. Caleb rode ahead, a dark silhouette against the fading stars, while Chayton flanked the wagon, his head constantly turning, scanning the ridges. Eliza pulled the rough wool blanket tighter. The silence was immense, broken only by the creak of the harness and the clopping of hooves. She was leaving. She had not been in Dust Haven long enough to call it home, but she had tried to build a life there, a small, respectable life. Now it was gone, taken from her by whispers, and then by a single act of defiance from a man she did not understand. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour. The sky was beginning to pale in the east, turning a sick, grayish purple. They were in a narrow cut, the trail flanked by tall stands of ocotillo and sharp yucca. It happened without warning. A single shot cracked the morning silence, and the livery driver slumped forward, the reins dropping from his hands. Before Eliza could even scream, a second shot splintered the wood by her head. The mules, terrified, brayed and reared. "Riders!" Caleb's voice was a roar. He was already wheeling his horse, his rifle in his hand. Chayton did not yell. He was just in motion. He fired into the rocks above them, and a man screamed, but more shapes were emerging. Hard-looking men on fast horses, blocking the trail ahead and behind. Blacktooth riders. "Get out! Get to the rocks!" Caleb bellowed at Eliza. The buckboard was a trap. The mules, leaderless, were trying to bolt, turning the wagon sideways, threatening to tip it. Eliza scrambled, half falling, over the side. She landed hard in the dust, the breath knocked out of her. A rider was bearing down on her, a big man with a thick beard, his face contorted. He was raising his pistol. A shot from Chayton, who was weaving his pinto through the yucca like a ghost, took the man in the chest. He flew backward off his horse. Caleb was by her side, his horse rearing as he leaned down, grabbing her by the arm. "Up now!" He hauled her up, bodily, in front of him on the saddle. It was not a gallant rescue. It was a desperate, painful heave of muscle. She landed hard against the pommel, his arm like a steel band around her waist. "Chayton the Red Gap!" Caleb yelled. His horse, a powerful bay Mustang, launched forward, not on the trail, but straight up the rocky embankment, scattering scree. Eliza clung to the horse's mane with one hand and to Caleb's arm with the other, her bonnet long gone, her hair tumbling down. She looked back and saw Chayton, his rifle gone, a pistol in each hand, riding backward, firing at the two riders who were pursuing him, leading them away from Caleb. "He is—" she started. "He knows what he is doing," Caleb grunted. They crested the rise and plunged into a field of dense, shoulder-high yucca. The sharp, spiked leaves tore at their clothes. Caleb guided the horse with his knees, his own rifle now in his hand, his arm still locked around Eliza. A bullet whined past her ear. So close she felt the heat of it. "Hold on!" he yelled, and it was the only thing he had said to her. He was not running from them. He was running to a place. The horse scrambled down a dry wash and into a narrow slot canyon, the walls a deep, angry red. The sound of the hoofbeats echoed, trapped, making it sound as if they were being chased by a dozen horses. They rounded a sharp bend, and the canyon opened into a small, sandy bowl. It was a dead end. Before Eliza could feel the panic of the trap, Caleb was off the horse, pulling her down with him. He shoved her behind a low boulder, pushing her head down. "Stay! Down!" He used the horse as cover, his breathing hard but even, his rifle resting on the saddle. He was no longer a rancher. He was the cavalry scout the rumors described, his eyes cold, his movements economical. The two riders who had chased them thundered into the bowl, their horses pulling up short in confusion at the dead end. Caleb's rifle fired. One man clutched his shoulder and his horse reared, throwing him. The second man, seeing the trap, raised his own rifle, but he was too slow. A sound, like a hawk's cry, came from the rim of the canyon above. The second rider looked up, and a knife, glinting in the new morning light, buried itself in his throat. He toppled from his horse, making no sound. Chayton Greyhawk stood on the rim, his chest heaving, his face a mask of fury. Silence. The only sounds were the snorting of the horses and the ringing in Eliza's ears. Caleb did not relax. He kept his rifle up, scanning the rim. Chayton slithered down the rock face in a cascade of dust and landed lightly on his feet. He walked to the man he had killed, retrieved his knife, and wiped it on the man's own shirt. Eliza, shaking, pushed herself up. Her hands were raw, her skirt torn. She looked at the two dead men, at the blood already soaking into the sand, and felt the bile rise in her throat. "They were not trying to warn us," she whispered. "They were trying to kill us." "They were paid to," Caleb said. He walked over to the first man he had shot, who was groaning, clutching his shoulder. Caleb kicked the man's pistol away. Chayton was already searching the pockets of the man he had killed. He pulled out a small leather pouch and a folded piece of paper. He ignored the pouch and unfolded the paper. He studied it for a moment, then handed it to Caleb. Eliza walked over, her legs unsteady. "What is it?" Caleb's face was dark. "It is a contract for water access rights, granting all rights to the springs on the land bordering mine, and any adjacent untapped sources." He pointed to the bottom of the page. "Signed." The signature was faint, the ink spidery and precise. Jed Merrick. "He did this," Eliza said. It was not a question. "He sent them to what, kill you?" "To kill me, and to clear the way for him to take my spring," Caleb said, his voice flat with a cold, deep anger. He looked at the wounded man, who was now glaring at them. "And you, Miss Hart, you were a loose end." Caleb looked at Chayton. "The livery hand." Chayton shook his head. "Dead." A wave of sickness hit Eliza. The young man was dead because of her. Because of this. Caleb turned to her. The world had changed in the last 10 minutes. There was no going back to Dust Haven. There was no respectability to be saved. There was only this canyon, 2 dead men, and the hard, unblinking reality of the contract in Caleb's hand. "They will be back," Caleb said. This was just the first probe. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "You cannot stay in town. You cannot leave the territory. Merrick will have you followed. You will come to the ranch." It was a statement, not an invitation. The old anger rose in her, the reflexive pride of a woman who had nothing else. "I will not," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I will not be your ward. I will not be what they called me. I will not be owned by you, Mr. Boone, just because you think you saved me. Owned." He took a step toward her, his face incredulous. "Owned, Miss Hart. I do not care about your reputation. I do not care about owning anything. Those men," he pointed, "were trying to put a bullet in your head, not because of who you are, but because of where you were, and you were with me. That is all that matters to Merrick." "Then I will go. I will walk away," she said, though she knew it was a lie. Where would she go? He looked at her for a long, hard moment. The anger in his eyes faded, replaced by something she could not name, a weariness that went bone deep. He looked away, up at the high, unforgiving canyon walls. "Everything I hold," he said, his voice low. "The desert wind takes, my family, my post, my horses. Merrick knows this. He thinks he is that wind. He thinks he can take my water, and he will kill anyone who stands near me." He looked back at her. "I am not offering you a soft life. Miss Hart, I am not offering you anything but a place to stand where they cannot shoot you in the back. But if you are at my ranch, you are under my protection, and they will have to come through me." Eliza looked at the contract. She looked at Chayton, who was silently binding the wounded rider's hands. She was a practical woman. She had been fired for a lie, She had been put up for auction. She had just been shot at. Her pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. But her independence was not. "I will come," she said, her voice clear now, all tremor gone. "With a condition." Caleb waited. "I am not a guest. I am not a woman under your protection, to be hidden away. I will work. I can cook. I can clean. I can sew. I saw the books at the mercantile. I can keep a ledger better than any man in this territory. I will earn my keep. Mr. Boone, I will not be indebted to you. No one owns me." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time, a flicker of something respect perhaps entered his gray eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Agreed." He turned to Chayton. "We will take the high trail. We will leave this one." He gestured to the prisoner. "For his friends to find, it will slow them down." As Caleb moved to get his horse, Chayton Greyhawk paused beside Eliza. He had been watching her, his dark eyes missing nothing. "You think freedom is being alone," he said, his voice quiet. "It is not. The lone wolf starves in a hard winter." Eliza met his gaze, surprised by his directness. He nodded toward Caleb, who was checking the cinch on his saddle. "Freedom is not walking away. Freedom is knowing who rides beside you when the storm hits." Chayton turned and swung up onto his pinto. Caleb brought his horse over, and this time he offered his hand. Eliza looked at it scarred, strong, and covered in dust. She placed her hand in his and let him pull her up. The three of them, with the wounded prisoner tied to his own horse and trailing behind, rode out of the bloody canyon, leaving the dead to the desert. They did not ride back toward Dust Haven. They rode deeper into the wilderness, toward the Boone Ranch, the rising sun painting the high, red cliffs the color of a fresh wound. The Boone Ranch was not a ranch. It was a fortress. It was tucked into a high, defensible valley, a cluster of low, solid buildings made of adobe and raw timber. The main house was functional. The corrals were sturdy, and everything, from the water trough to the hitching post, was built to withstand a siege or a storm. There were no flowers, no white picket fences. There was only the wind, the smell of horses, and the vast, aching emptiness of the surrounding high desert. Caleb led Eliza to a small, clean room off the main hall. It contained a narrow iron bedstead, a washstand, and a small, three-legged table. The one window looked out over the horse pens. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice flat, offering no sentiment. "No one will bother you here." He placed her small bag on the bed. "The kitchen is through there. I have two hands. They are paid to work, not to talk. You are Miss Hart, the new bookkeeper." He left. There was no welcome, no comfort. There was only the agreement. Eliza sat on the hard mattress for a long moment. She was alive. She was unhurt, and she was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner of circumstance, living under the roof of a man she barely knew. A man who had declared himself her protector by way of a public brawl and a gunfight. She did not rest. She stood, unpacked her few items, and washed the dust of the trail from her face and hands. The water in the pitcher was cool and sweet, a luxury she had not been expecting. She then walked to the kitchen. It was a large, serviceable room, dominated by a heavy iron stove. A man with a grizzled beard, who looked to be in his 50s, was trying to slice bacon with a knife better suited for skinning. "Coffee is on," he grunted, not looking up. "You are holding that knife at the wrong angle," Eliza said, her voice clear in the morning quiet. The man, whose name she would learn was Pete, stopped and stared at her as if she had just grown a second head. Eliza walked to the stove, found a cup, and poured herself a measure of the thick, black coffee. She took a sip. It was strong enough to peel paint, and you are burning your beans. She set down the cup, untied her good bonnet, and hung it on a peg. She found an apron hanging behind the door, a rough thing made of sacking, and tied it around her waist. My name is Eliza Hart. I am the new bookkeeper. But it seems you need a cook more." She took a smaller, sharper knife from a wooden block, picked up the slab of bacon, and began slicing thin, even strips. Pete just watched, his mouth open. Life on the ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the horses. Eliza kept her bargain. She took over the kitchen, turning out edible, hearty meals. She found Caleb's ledgers, which were a disaster of crossed-out numbers and coffee stains, and began the long, meticulous process of bringing order to his chaos. But she did not stay inside. She learned to mend the heavy leather harnesses with a curved needle and waxed thread. Her fingers, accustomed to fine sewing, quickly adapting to the tougher work. She learned the names of the horses, their temperaments, and their value. One afternoon, a young mare came in from the range, her shoulder torn open by a mountain lion. She was a valuable horse, and she was bleeding badly. The two hands, Pete and a younger man named Silas, were holding her, but she was wild with pain. "She is done for," Silas said, looking at the ragged, gaping wound. "Caleb ain't here. We should put her down." "You will not," Eliza said, walking into the corral. She held her hand out, speaking in a low, calm voice to the terrified animal. "Hold her steady. Pete, get me the whiskey from the kitchen, the carbolic, and my sewing kit, the one with the heavy needles." "Ma'am," Pete said, shocked. "Now, Pete." They had never heard that tone from her. They moved. For the next hour, Eliza worked. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, her touch firm and gentle. The horse trembled and sweated, but Eliza's voice, a constant, soothing murmur, seemed to calm her. With a steady hand, she stitched the torn flesh back together, her movements as precise as if she were mending a silk dress. When she was done, she bandaged it tightly with strips of clean flour sacking. When Caleb rode in 2 hours later, he found the mare in a separate pen, quietly eating oats, and Eliza washing blood from her hands at the pump. Silas told him what had happened. Caleb walked over to the mare, examined the handiwork, and then looked at Eliza. He said nothing. He just nodded, a single, sharp dip of his chin. It was the highest praise she had yet received. Her new life was interrupted 2 weeks after her arrival. A smart black buggy, an absurd vehicle for the rough track to the ranch, pulled up in a cloud of dust. Eliza, who was airing out blankets, stopped. She recognized the buggy. Mrs. Thorne, the preacher's wife, and Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, emerged. They were the arbiters of Dusthaven's moral code. They pulled their skirts tight, their faces masks of grim, Christian duty, and marched to the porch. "Eliza, Mrs. Thorne said, her voice like a hammer striking ice. "We have come for you." "I am not lost, Mrs. Thorne," Eliza said, remaining on the porch, not inviting them in. "You are, Mrs. Gable snapped. "You are living in sin. Child. In the house of an unmarried man, a man who does not even attend services. You have made a mockery of this town." "The town made a mockery of me," Eliza said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Or did you forget the prosperity gala?" The women had the grace to flush. "That was unfortunate," Mrs. Thorne admitted. "But your actions, Eliza running off with him, it confirmed every rumor. But there is a way to fix this, to restore your good name and his." "A way?" Eliza asked, her hands folding over each other. "A wedding," Mrs. Thorne said, her eyes gleaming with the righteousness of her mission. "A proper, hasty wedding. It will settle the talk. It will make your arrangement respectable. We will speak to Mr. Boone. He is a hard man, but he will listen to reason. He will do his duty by you." Eliza looked at these two women, who had sat by and watched her humiliation, who had whispered about her, and who had now come all this way to force her into a cage they deemed acceptable. "No," Eliza said. "No," Mrs. Thorne's jaw dropped. "No," I will not marry a man to make the town of Deucehaven feel comfortable. I will not trade one kind of auction for another. My name is my own, to do with as I please. And my arrangement, as you call it, is one of employment. I am Mr. Boone's bookkeeper." "Bookkeeper, Mrs." Gable scoffed, looking at Eliza's dusty skirt and the apron she still wore. "I thank you for your concern," Eliza said, stepping back toward the door. "It is a long, hot ride back to town. You should start before the sun is at its highest." She turned, walked inside, and closed the door, leaving the two women sputtering in a cloud of their own indignation. The buggy was barely out of sight when another rider appeared. This one was official, wearing the badge of a county deputy, but Eliza recognized him as one of Merrick's men. He did not dismount. He handed a letter to Caleb, who had come out to meet him. Caleb took the letter, read it, and his face, already hard, seemed to turn to stone. He watched the rider go. Then, slowly, he crumpled the paper in his fist. "What is it?" Eliza asked from the doorway. He uncreased the paper and handed it to her. It was an official notice from the Dusthaven Bank, a note for a loan Caleb's father had taken out, which Merrick had bought, was being called in. The full amount was due in 30 days. "He is choking you," Eliza whispered, reading the sum. It was impossibly large. "At the bottom," Caleb said. Eliza's eyes fell to the handwritten addendum, signed by Jed Merrick. The bank would be willing to extend flexible terms for the loan, provided Mr. Boone was willing to discuss the immediate sale of his water rights. "He has us," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "The drought is bad, but my spring still runs. He knows I cannot pay." That night, the three of them sat in the kitchen. The letter lay on the table between them, a declaration of war. "He does not know everything," Chayton said, breaking the long silence. "He was tracing a pattern in some spilled salt on the table. There is other water." Caleb looked at him. "Where the creek is dust." "The old ones, the ND," Chayton said, using the name for his people. "There is a well, a spring, from the old times. It is high, in the canyons. My grandfather told me of it. It is a hard place to find, but he said it never ran dry." "If it is there, Merrick will have heard of it," Caleb said. "He has heard of it," Chayton said, his voice grim. "But he does not know where it is. I do. We ride tonight." They rode out under a sliver of moon, 3 shadows moving through a world of rock and dust. They left the horses tethered in a ravine and climbed the rest of the way on foot. Chayton led them up a narrow game trail, to a box canyon Eliza never would have seen. "It is here," Chayton whispered, pointing. At the back of the canyon, hidden by a growth of thorny scrub, was a dark opening in the rock. It was not a spring, it was a well, lined with stones so old they were smooth. Caleb lit a match. The well was deep, but it was not empty of water. It was full of rocks. It had been filled deliberately and recently. "Look," Eliza said, pointing with a trembling finger. Chayton moved forward and, with his knife, gently prized something from a crack in the rock. He held it up to the moonlight. It was a stick of dynamite, with a fuse. "He found it." Caleb's voice was terrible. "He could not use the water, so he destroyed it. He blocked it, and he left this to welcome anyone who tried to clear it." "He was one step ahead," Eliza murmured, the cold of the dynamite seeping into her. Merrick was not just a banker. He was a monster. They rode back in silence. The mission of failure. They made a cold camp, unwilling to risk a fire. The night was vast. The stars so bright and cold they looked like chips of ice. Eliza sat, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at them. Caleb sat across from her, his rifle across his knees, his face turned toward the trail. "The scar," Eliza said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "The one on your temple." Was it the Black-Tooth Riders? He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. No, he said, his voice rough. It was the United States Cavalry. She waited. I was a scout, he said, his eyes on the dark horizon. We were tracking a band of Chiricahua. The captain was a man who saw glory in killing. We found the camp. He gave the order to attack. His voice was hoarse. It was not a war party. Miss Hart, it was families, old men, women, children. He called it a hostile engagement. It was a massacre. I did not obey the order. I rode my horse between them and my own men. This, he touched his temple, is what the captain gave me for my trouble. What happened? She whispered. I left. I deserted. They call it, I rode until I could not ride anymore. I came here to land my mother had owned. I started with the horses because they make more sense than men. Eliza watched him, this hard, silent man, and saw the deep, unhealed wound he carried, so much worse than the silver scar. The town, she said, her own voice quiet. They call me too old, expired. Because I am 29 and a widow, they look at me, and they see something that has passed its usefulness. That is its own kind of massacre, I suppose. He turned his head and looked at her, really looked at her. They are fools. Eliza. He had used her name. It hung in the air between them, a small, warm thing in the vast, cold dark. They returned to the ranch with the grim knowledge of the blocked well. The work was harder now, edged with desperation. They had to fix the fences, train the colts, all while the 30-day deadline ticked down. Eliza was helping Silas with a young, half-wild colt, trying to get a rope on it. The horse reared. The rope sang, and as it snapped taut, it lashed back, catching Eliza across the back of her left hand. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath. The rope had taken the skin. It was a deep, fiery red burn. She gritted her teeth, but the pain was dizzying. Before she could react, Caleb was there. He had seen it from the other side of the corral. Let me see, he commanded. It is nothing, she said, her voice strained. He ignored her, taking her hand. His own was dark, calloused, and covered in grime, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he turned her hand over to inspect the wound. This is not nothing, he said. He led her to the water trough and, taking a clean rag, dipped it in the cool water and carefully cleaned the wound. She hissed as the water hit the raw skin. Hold still, he murmured. He took her into the kitchen, sat her down, and retrieved a small tin of salve from a shelf. It smelled of pine and herbs. He did not ask permission. He scooped a small amount on his fingers and began to work it into the burn. His touch was firm, but infinitely tender. Her hand was small and pale against his. She could feel the roughness of his fingertips and the controlled strength in his hand. Her heart was beating a strange, fast rhythm against her ribs. She looked at his bent head, the way his dark hair fell forward, the line of his jaw tight with concentration. He took a clean strip of cloth and began to bandage her hand. His fingers brushed the inside of her wrist, and a jolt, sharp and clean, went through her. She saw his hand tremble, just once, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. He finished, tying the knot with a quick, practiced motion. He did not let go immediately. His hand lingered, his thumb resting on her pulse. He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. The air in the small kitchen was thick, charged with something new and unnamed. It was the silence of the desert night, full of stars and unspoken things. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. He held her gaze for 1 second longer, and then, slowly, as if pulling against a magnet, he released her hand. He stood up, clearing his throat. That will hold, he said, his voice rougher than usual. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Eliza staring at her bandaged hand, the scent of pine salve in the air, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. The small, charged moment in the kitchen was broken by the sound of a horse being ridden too hard. All three of them, Eliza, Caleb, and Pete, ran to the porch. Silas, the younger hand, was galloping toward them from the east pasture, his face a mask of panic. "Mr. Boone, fire," he yelled, his voice cracking. "It is the relay station, the common trough. It is burning." Caleb was moving before Silas had even stopped, grabbing the rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. "Chayton!" he yelled. Chayton was already on his pinto, appearing from the side of the canyon as if he had been waiting. The two men rode off as one, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Eliza was left on the porch, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. The common water station. It was a set of deep troughs halfway between the ranches and the town, fed by a slow windmill pump. It was the only water for a dozen miles, neutral ground. They returned 3 hours later. The sun was high and brutal. The men were covered in soot and sweat, their faces grim. "It is gone," Caleb said, swinging down from his horse. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the pump and put his head under the gushing water. "They burned the cistern, shot holes in the troughs, and cut the windmill blades. It is dry." "The horses?" Eliza asked, her voice low. "They are thirsty," he said, wiping his face on his sleeve. "And the whole valley will be thirsty in a day." Worse, the town was not on his side. Later that afternoon, a deputy, the same one who had delivered Merrick's letter, rode up. He was not there to offer help. "Caleb Boone," the deputy said, staying on his horse, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Folks are saying this trouble started when you brought her." He nodded at Eliza on the porch. "Out here, and now the water station is burned. Seems like you are drawing trouble like a dead mule draws flies." "Is that an accusation, deputy?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It is an observation," the deputy said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Jed Merrick is holding a town meeting to discuss the Boone problem. You have got no water, and you have got no friends." He rode off, his message delivered. The economic noose was tightening. The horses in the corral were already restless, moving to the empty troughs, sniffing the dry wood. That night, in the kitchen, the reality of their situation settled. Eliza had the ledgers open. "The note is due in 23 days, she said, her bandaged hand flat on the page. "There is no money, not enough to pay 1/10 of it." "And with the station gone," Caleb said, pacing the room like a caged wolf. "My horses will be too weak to sell. He does not even have to do anything else. He just has to wait." "He will not wait," Chayton said from the corner where he was sharpening his knife. "Merrick is a snake. He has struck. He will strike again." "We cannot get to the Apache well," Caleb said, running his hands through his hair. "It is blocked. We cannot clear it in time, and it is a trap." "What if," Eliza said, her voice clear, cutting through the despair. They both looked at her. "What if we do not clear it for us? What if we clear it for the drive?" Caleb stared at her. "What drive?" "You have—" She consulted a page in her ledger. 112 horses ready for sale. The army at Fort Grant is always buying, but the trail is long. You need water. "The trail runs past the high canyons," Caleb said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The Apache well," Chayton finished. The plan was insane. It was a 3-man, 1-woman horse drive, across hostile territory, to a market they might not reach, with a water source that was a death trap. It was also the only chance they had. "We have to clear the well," Caleb said, his voice now set. "And we have to do it without Merrick knowing. If he finds out we are moving the herd, he will send the riders." Chayton said, "He wants the horses to die here, so he can take the land." "The bank assistant," Caleb said, a new thought striking him. "The one who set the dynamite, he would know about the well. He will be nervous," Chayton said, his eyes distant. His trap did not spring. A man who sets a bad trap. He goes back to check his work. "We ride," Caleb said. This time all three of them went. They rode in the pre-dawn dark, taking the high, hidden trails. Chayton led, his pinto moving with a silent, ghostly tread. They left their horses, as before, and climbed. As they neared the box canyon, Chayton held up a hand. He pointed, not at the well, but at a cluster of boulders above it. A horse was tethered there, badly hidden. Chayton motioned for them to wait. He moved off, blending into the rock so completely that Eliza lost sight of him in an instant. They waited. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks. There was a sound, a muffled scuffle, a single, choked cry, and then silence. Chayton reappeared at the canyon mouth. He was not alone. He was dragging a man by the collar, a man in a town suit, his spectacles askew, his face pale with terror. It was Mr. Sipes's assistant, a young, weedy man named Barlow. "He was at the well," Chayton said, shoving the man to his knees before Caleb. "He had more dynamite." "Please," Barlow whimpered, his hands shaking so badly he could not clasp them. "Please, I was just doing what he said." "Who?" Caleb's voice was a low growl. Mr. Merrick, Mr. Sipes, they made me. They said the dynamite was just to protect the claim, to scare anyone off. I do not know how to set fuses right. I think I ruined it." "You did," Caleb said. He hauled the man to his feet. "You were coming back to set a new trap." "No, yes, I mean, they were angry. They said you were trouble." Barlow was crying now, snot and tears streaking the dust on his face. "They said you had to be stopped." "Stopped how?" Eliza asked, stepping forward, her voice cold. Barlow looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, and his terror deepened. "The riders, they were supposed to just scare you on the trail, but you fought back. Now Mr. Merrick is furious. He is done waiting." "When?" Caleb demanded, shaking the man like a rag doll. "Soon, the day after the loan is due, whether you pay or not. He said he is foreclosing one way or another. He is paying the Blacktooth riders to burn you out, all of you," he said. Barlow looked at Eliza. "Especially the bookkeeper." They had a date, and they had a confession. They left Barlow tied up, with a canteen of water, for his friends to find. He was no longer a threat. He was just a message. They rode back with a new, frantic energy. The sky was a strange, yellowish gray, and the wind had a high, thin-sounding whine. "Sky is telling lies," Chayton said, looking up. His face creased. "It looks like rain, but it smells like dust. A storm is coming." He was right. By afternoon, the world had turned red. It came from the north, a wall of churning, rust-colored dust that blotted out the sun. The wind did not gust. It screamed, a solid physical force that stung the skin and stole the breath. "The horses!" Caleb roared over the din. "Get them into the main corral now." They ran, all four of them, into the maelstrom. The herd, already nervous from the thirst, was frantic. They were bucking, kicking, and running blind in the suffocating, stinging cloud. The world shrank to a radius of 3 feet. Eliza, her hair torn from its pins, a bandana tied over her nose and mouth, found herself next to Caleb. "I cannot see," he yelled, his voice muffled. "We will lose them. They will scatter and die." Pete, the old hand, shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "No," Eliza shouted back, her voice surprisingly strong. "Rope, get the long rope from the barn." She did not wait. She ran, stumbling, her eyes squeezed shut, counting the steps to the barn. She found the heavy lariat, a long, thick rope used for pulling wagons. She ran back, a ghost in the redout. "Here!" she screamed, shoving the rope into Caleb's hand. Tie it to the main post, we make a line. Tie yourself. He understood. He wrapped the rope around the thick, central post of the corral. Chayton, seeing the plan, grabbed the other end. Silas, Pete, tie yourselves to the line. Do not let go, she commanded. They were a human chain in the middle of chaos. The horses, blind and terrified, surged around them. Stay together, Eliza yelled. Caleb, Chayton, move the line. We move as one. We will push them toward the barn. For what felt like an eternity, they fought the storm. It was not a battle of strength, but of will. Eliza was the anchor. Her hand, the one that was not bandaged, was locked on the rope. She did not panic. She kept her feet, her head down, her mind clear. She was no longer too old. She was the calm at the center of the wind. They managed to push the bulk of the herd, more by feel than sight, into the relative shelter of the large, open-sided barn, which was protected by an overhang of the canyon. When the last of the mares was in, they stumbled in after them, collapsing against the hay bales, their lungs burning, their bodies caked in a thick paste of sweat and grit. The storm raged outside, a living thing, howling and tearing at the world, but inside the barn there was a strange, sudden peace. The air was thick with the warm, dusty smell of hay and the sharp, animal scent of the horses. The animals were quiet now, their flanks heaving, their presence a comfort. Eliza leaned her head back against a bale, pulling the bandana down. Her face was streaked, her lips cracked. Caleb was sitting a few feet away, watching her. Pete and Silas were at the far end, already asleep, utterly spent. Chayton was a shadow near the door, his eyes on the storm. You... Caleb started, his voice hoarse. You saved them. We saved them, Eliza said, her voice rough with dust. She was so tired she could barely move. He pushed himself up and walked over. He did not sit, but knelt in front of her. The light in the barn was dim, the air thick with golden, swirling dust motes. You are a wonder, Eliza Hart, he said, his voice low, stripped of its usual hardness. He reached out, his hand hesitating, and then his thumb, rough and calloused, brushed a streak of mud from her cheek. His touch was electric, like the air before a lightning strike. She did not pull away. She did not breathe. He leaned in. She could see the gray of his eyes, the deep lines of exhaustion at their corners. She could feel the heat of him, smell the dust and the man. His head tilted, his lips were an inch from hers. It was what she wanted. A part of her, a part she had thought long dead, was screaming for it. No, she whispered. He stopped, his eyes questioning. I cannot, she said, her voice shaking but firm. She did not move back, but she held his gaze. I will not. Eliza. His voice was rough with a need that matched her own. I will not kiss you as an act of gratitude, she said, the words costing her. Or as a payment for saving me. Or for this. She gestured around at the barn. The ranch. I am still in your debt, Mr. Boone. I want... She took a shaky breath, finding the truth. I want a kiss to be a choice, not a debt. Caleb held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment. The storm howled. The horses shifted. He looked at her, at the strength he had not seen before, the strength he now saw in everything she did. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his hand back. He sat back on his heels, a small, strange smile, not a smile at all, but a deep acknowledgement, touched his lips. Then we will wait, he said, his voice a low promise, until it is a choice. He stood, gave her one last look, and walked to the other side of the barn to check on the mares. Eliza let out the breath she had been holding. Her hand was trembling, not from the rope, not from the storm, from the door. Chayton Greyhawk spoke, his voice as quiet as the dust, his eyes on the red, raging sky. Liars use many words, he said, to no one and everyone. They make a big wind. He looked back at Eliza. The desert speaks little, but it is true. The date Barlow had given them, the day after the loan was due, arrived with a false, fragile peace. The wind that had scoured the valley had died, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and a silence that felt heavy. They had worked for 2 days with a frantic, sleepless energy, fortifying the well, hiding the horses, and preparing for the drive. But the attack did not come. The silence was the lie. It came in the hour just before dawn, the hour of deepest dark, when the cold makes men sleep their soundest. It was not a sound that woke Eliza. It was the smell, a sharp, resinous smell that did not belong pitch and kerosene. She was out of her bed in an instant, her heart a cold hammer. She ran to the window. The sky was not dark. It was glowing a sick, predatory orange. The main barn was on fire. A yell, an unholy scream, was ripped from Caleb's throat, and it was the signal. A volley of shots erupted from the darkness, not at the house, but at the corrals, to panic the horses. "Eliza, stay inside," Caleb roared, pulling on his boots, his rifle already in hand. But the Blacktooth riders had planned for the wind. The air was still, and the fire, set at multiple points, was not spreading wildly. It was climbing, a deliberate, contained inferno, designed to gut the ranch's heart. "Hey, Pete, Silas, get the main herd, cut them loose, drive them to the high pasture now," Caleb yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Chayton." A single rifle shot answered him from the rocks above the house. A rider, one of the Blacktooth, who had been about to throw a torch onto the house roof, screamed and fell from his saddle. Chayton was already in position. He was the guardian on the wall. Eliza ran to the porch, her bare feet stinging on the cold wood. The heat was already a physical blow, a hot, dry breath that sucked the moisture from her eyes. The barn was a tower of flames. "The foals!" she screamed, the words tearing from her throat. The colts and their mothers, the future of the herd, were in the smaller, adjacent barn, the one the fire was just now beginning to lick at. Caleb heard her. He was running toward the main corral, a knife in his hand to cut the ropes. "I cannot. The herd, Eliza, the house." He was right. He had to make the hard choice. The main herd was the money. The house was their lives. The foals were a luxury they could not afford to save. Eliza looked at the pump. The hose was there. She knew, with a sick certainty, that the pressure would be too little, the fire too much, but she ran to it anyway. Grabbing the nozzle, pulling the heavy canvas hose, her muscles straining, she turned the spigot. A weak, pathetic stream gurgled out. It would not reach. She dropped it. She looked at the burning foal barn. She heard the terrified, high-pitched screaming of the horses inside. She was not a bookkeeper. She was not a victim. She was a woman on a burning ranch. She ran toward the fire. "Eliza, no," she heard Pete yell, but he was already busy, swallowed by the chaos of the main herd as he and Silas drove them, a thunder of hooves, out of the corral and into the darkness. The foal barn door was jammed, the wood already swelling with the heat. She could hear the horses kicking and screaming inside. The main lock was on the outside, but the fire was climbing the wall, and she could not get to it. There was another way, a small side door to the tack room. She covered her mouth with her nightgown sleeve and kicked it open. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed out, driving her back. She dropped to her knees, where the air was clearer, and crawled inside. The heat was an oven. She could see the fire, not as flames, but as a glowing, hungry red through the cracks in the walls. The foals were at the far end, in their pens. She ran, bent double, her lungs on fire. She unlatched the first gate, slapping the mare's flank. "Go-go!" The horse, wild with terror, bolted, crashing through the stall. Eliza moved to the next, and the next. She was coughing, her eyes streaming, the world a red, smoky hell. She got the last one out. But the horses, confused, were just milling in the center aisle, trapped between her and the main door, which was now fully engulfed. "Yeah!" she screamed, her voice a raw croak. She grabbed a rake from the wall, the handle already hot, and ran at them, beating the air, a wild, soot-covered figure. "Go through the side." She drove them, a small, terrified herd, back through the tack room, out into the night, where they scattered into the valley. Meanwhile, Caleb had seen the main herd to safety. He turned back, his face a mask of fury, his rifle hot in his hands. He was met not by a rider, but by a wall of smoke, and through the smoke, a man walked. Vance Crow, the leader of the Black-Tooth Riders, a man as big as a bear, with a thick black beard and eyes like burning coals. He was not shooting. He was smiling, a long, curved skinning knife in his hand. "Boone," his voice was a gravelly roar. "Merrick pays well. But this I would have done for free. I hate a man who will not stay beaten." Caleb did not speak. He raised his rifle. Crow laughed and dove. Grabbing Caleb by the knees, the two men went down in the dust, in the hellish red light of the burning barn. It was not a fight. It was a brawl. Caleb was strong, but Crow was heavier, fueled by a brute malice. Caleb's rifle was lost. He reached for his own knife, but Crow was on top of him, his fist crashing into Caleb's face. Once, twice. Caleb was stunned. Crow scrambled, straddling him, the big knife raised. "Now, scout," he panted. "Let's see what color your insides are." Eliza stumbled out of the burning tack room, having seen the last foal to safety. She was gasping for air, her nightgown half burned, her hair singed. She saw the two men, a dark knot of violence in the yard. She saw Caleb on the ground. She saw the knife go up. She did not scream. She did not think. She looked around, desperate. There was no gun, no one to call. Her eyes landed on the open door of the small curing shed, a shed she had organized just last week. Just inside, she knew, was a 100-pound sack of rock salt. She ran to it. She did not try to lift the sack. She ripped the burlap open with her raw, burned hands, scooping up a double handful of the coarse, sharp crystals. She ran back, silent on her bare feet. Crow was savoring it, his arm pulling back for the final, brutal thrust. "This is for my men in the canyon," he roared. "Go to hell," Eliza screamed. He looked up, confused, his eyes wide. At that exact moment, Eliza threw the rock salt with all the force of her body, straight into his face. It was a direct hit. The sharp crystals bit into his eyes, his nose, his open, screaming mouth. He shrieked, a high, unhuman sound, and dropped the knife, his hands clawing at his face. My eyes. Caleb did not wait. He kicked upward with all his strength, sending Crow staggering backward. Caleb rolled, finding his own knife, and was on his feet in one motion. But he did not have to use it. Crow, blind and mad with pain, stumbled backward, roaring. He staggered directly into the path of the main barn's wall, which, its support beams finally eaten through, collapsed outward in a tidal wave of fire and sparks. One moment, Vance Crow was a man. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the inferno. Eliza stood, shaking, her arm still out, her hand empty. She was panting, her chest heaving, the soot on her face tracked by tears she did not know she was crying. The barn fire roared, a celebration of its victory. In the red demonic light, Eliza looked at Caleb. He was looking at her, his face bloody, his chest rising and falling, his knife still in his hand. The remaining riders, seeing their leader consumed by the fire, and hearing the steady, deadly crack of Chayton's rifle from the ridge, lost their nerve. They were hired guns, not fanatics. They turned and fled, melting back into the darkness from which they had come. Silence fell, broken only by the roar and crackle of the fire and the distant, thin nickering of the scattered horses. The sun was rising, a pale, indifferent pink, on a scene of devastation. The main barn was gone, a pile of glowing, smoking embers. The full barn was a charred skeleton. The air stank of burned wood, burned hay, and burned death. Eliza walked, her feet numb, toward the wreckage of the full barn. She had driven them out. She had one mare, the one she had stitched up after the lion attack. The horse had been in the last stall. She was not with the others. Eliza found her. She had made it as far as the tack room, but the smoke had been too much, or a beam had fallen. She was lying on her side, her coat, once a bright sorrel, now dull with ash. She was dead. Eliza stopped. She just stopped. This one horse, this one symbol of her ability to heal, to fix things, and she had failed. Caleb came up behind her. He saw the mare. He saw the perfect, useless stitches Eliza had sewn. He saw the loss. This was the one horse he had trusted to her care. He walked past Eliza and knelt by the mare's head. He did not say anything. He just touched the horse's neck, his bloody, grimy hand stark against the ash. He bowed his head. His shoulders slumped. He had won the fight. He had saved the herd. And he had lost. He was, in that moment, a man on his knees. Eliza watched him, this strong, hard man, who Belazov the desert wind took everything he held. She watched him being proven right. She felt a new kind of anger, not at Merrick, not at the fire, but at the fate that was trying to break him. She walked to him, her bare feet silent in the thick ash. She stood beside him. He did not look up. She knelt in the grime, facing him. Her hand, the one that was not bandaged, the one that had thrown the salt, was black with soot. She lifted it, not to his bloody face, but to his cheek, to the clean, unbroken skin. He flinched, then leaned into her touch. He looked up, his gray eyes a storm of grief and rage and a terrible, raw exhaustion. She said nothing. There were no words for this. She leaned in, and she kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. It was not the kiss they had almost shared in the hay. It was a kiss of ash and smoke, of blood and salt. It was a kiss that tasted of defeat and survival. It was a promise, a claim, a planting of a flag in a burned-out territory. She poured all of her practicality, her anger, her fear, and her new, terrifying strength into it. She pulled back, her forehead resting against his. She looked into his eyes. "I choose," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "This, I choose it." Caleb stared at her. He saw the fire reflected in her eyes, but it was not the fire of the barn. It was her own. He lifted his hand, covering hers, pressing it harder against his face. "I hear you," he whispered, his voice thick. He did not let go. He used her hand and her strength to pull himself to his feet, and he brought her up with him. They stood, two survivors, covered in the ashes of their old lives, and watched the sun come up over the wreckage of their ranch. The kiss was a brand, a claim made in the heart of their ruin. But the new dawn brought no peace, only a landscape of ash and a cold, hard accounting. The main barn was gone. The full barn was a skeleton. Their food stores were smoke. Their tack was melted leather. And the body of the dead mare was a stark reminder of their loss. "We have the main herd," Caleb said, his voice a rasp. He was splinting Chayton's arm, which had been grazed by a bullet. "They are scattered in the high pasture. We have the well." "We have no food, no barn, and no time," Eliza said, her voice practical, though she was shaking. She was wearing a pair of Caleb's own trousers and a shirt, her singed nightgown long since discarded. "Merrick will know he failed. He will not stop." "He will come back," Chayton said, his face impassive as Caleb tied the knot. "He lost men. He lost Crow. This is blood now, not just business." "No," a new voice said, smooth and cold. From the edge of the clearing, they all spun. Jed Merrick was there, sitting on a fine black horse, not 50 yards away. He was not alone. He had 6 men with him, all heavily armed. But they were not Blacktooth riders. They were town men, deputies and shopkeepers, all wearing badges, a posse. And in the center of them, his face a grotesque mask of bubbled, weeping scar tissue, was Vance Crowe. He was alive. The barn collapse had not consumed him. It had only reforged him into something monstrous. He was tied to his saddle, his eyes 2 slits of pure hatred, fixed on Eliza. "The attack on your ranch was an act of lawlessness," Merrick announced, his voice booming with false authority. "And we are here to see it does not continue." "You are here," Caleb said, his rifle in his hand, "because you paid for it." "Lies," Merrick sneered. "The town is tired of your war. Boone, you and your Apache friend, and this woman, you have brought this fire on all of us. But I am a reasonable man." He pulled a document from his coat. "This ends now. You will sign over the water rights to the town council, for the good of all. In exchange, I will call off this posse, and you will be allowed to leave the territory. Refuse, and we will be forced to arrest you for inciting a riot and harboring a known fugitive." He nodded at Chayton. "It was a perfect trap." "And if I sign," Caleb said, "what of Miss Hart?" "She is the cause of all this," one of the townsmen shouted. "That 2-old bride who thinks she can—" "She," Merrick said, his eyes cold and dead, "will be taken into protective custody, for her own safety, back to town, until she can be relocated." Eliza knew what relocated meant: an asylum, a workhouse, anywhere she could be silenced. "You will not have her," Caleb said, his voice low. "I do not think you have a choice." Merrick smiled, and then it all happened too fast. Chayton, with his good hand, threw the knife he had been cleaning. It was not aimed at Merrick, but at the face of the man holding the reins of the lead stallion, the best horse, which the posse had captured. The man screamed and dropped the rope. "Now!" Chayton roared. Caleb did not hesitate. He fired, not at a man, but at the ground in front of Merrick's horse, sending it rearing in panic. The posse, a disorganized rabble, broke. "Eliza, to the house!" Caleb yelled. But she was not at the house. In the confusion, Vance Crowe, his bonds cut by a Confederate, had spurred his horse forward. He was not a man, he was a claw. He leaned down and grabbed Eliza by the front of her shirt, lifting her, screaming, from the ground. "No!" Caleb roared, but it was too late. Crowe, with Eliza slung in front of him, was already galloping away, following Merrick, who was fleeing toward the only landmark in sight, the plume of smoke. "Chayton!" Caleb yelled, running to the stallion. "I am with you," Chayton said, already on his pinto. They were following them into hell. The smoke was from Devil's Fire Gorge, a narrow slot canyon to the north. A dry lightning strike from the storm had set the timber on the rim ablaze, and the wind was driving the wildfire down into the canyon, turning it into a furnace. Merrick was insane. He was riding into a death trap. "He thinks it is a shortcut," Chayton yelled over the sound of the hooves. "To cut us off." "He has Eliza," was all Caleb said. They rode. The heat was a wall. The air was thick with smoke and ash. They entered the gorge, and the world became a nightmare. The walls were high, the path was narrow, and the fire was not just on the rim, it was raining down and burning, molten gold embers. Ahead, they could see them. Merrick was in the lead. Crowe, his horse struggling, was behind him, with Eliza. She was fighting, a small, wild thing. "Merrick!" Crowe yelled, his voice a ruined croak. "The fire! It is ahead of us! We are trapped!" A wall of flame, 100 feet high, had just leaped the canyon, blocking the pass. They were in a box of fire. "Sign it!" Merrick screamed. his voice thin with terror. He had pulled his horse up and was riding back to Eliza. He held a new document and a pencil. "Sign the rights, sign them, or I will leave you to him." He was bargaining, even now, with the world ending around him.
"Eliza,"
her hands tied,
spat in his face.
"Then burn!" Merrick shrieked, and he turned his horse, trying to find a way back.
"Caleb!"
Eliza screamed, her voice lost in the roar. But he was there. He was coming, not from behind, from above. Caleb had seen the trap. He had turned the stallion, a horse of muscle and wild heart, and had taken it up the side of the canyon, a path no sane man would try. He was on the rim, a silhouette against the fire. "Caleb, you cannot!" Chayton yelled from below. Chayton was at the canyon mouth, trying to beat back the flames with a wet saddle blanket, trying to keep their escape route open. Caleb looked down. The drop was 50 feet. The landing spot was a small shelf of rock, just above the inferno. Below him, he could see Eliza, her face turned up to him, a pale speck in the orange haze. He could see Crow, his knife out, moving toward her. He did not hesitate. He spurred the stallion. The horse, trusting the man on its back, leaped. It was a terrible, beautiful thing, a flight of madness. The horse hit the shelf, its legs buckling, but it held. Caleb was off in an instant, sliding down the scree, his boots smoking. "The whole town can turn their backs," he roared, his voice cracking, but carrying over the fire. "I would ride through hell for you." It was the promise from the title. It was his truth. Crow turned, his burned face a mask of disbelief. "You—" He raised his knife, but he was not fighting a man. He was fighting a force. Caleb met him, not with a gun, but with his body. The two men crashed together, a tangle of rage. Eliza cuts her own ropes. They escape. Chayton is burned, a horse dies, and Merrick escapes. You have to finish the entire part. Continue writing from here. The fight just started. Finish the scene. They rode into the county seat not as victors, but as plaintiffs, covered in ash, soot, and dried blood. They carried with them the one thing that had survived the inferno, Jed Merrick's leather-bound ledger. The book was a meticulous record of his greed, detailing every illegal land grab, every bribed official, and every dollar paid to the Black Tooth Riders. The courthouse was a new 2-story brick building that represented the taming of the territory. But the men inside were not new. The jury box was filled with faces from Dust Haven shopkeepers who had notes at Merrick's bank, ranchers who relised on his goodwill. Jed Merrick himself sat at the defendant's table, looking clean, pressed, and confident. He was represented by a high-priced lawyer from the territorial capital. The air was thick with prejudice and August heat. Judge Harlan was a man who did not fit the room. He was old, with a spine like a railroad tie, and eyes that had seen too much. He was a former Army Corps engineer, a man who belazaved in maps, numbers, and the letter of the law. He looked at Caleb, Chayton, and Eliza with the same measured distaste he held for everyone. "This court is in session," he said, his voice like gravel. Merrick's lawyer went first. He was slick and loud. He painted Caleb as a violent deserter who had fallen under the sway of a disgraced woman. He called Chayton a hostile and suggested the ledger had been stolen and falsified. "These are desperate people, gentlemen of the jury," the lawyer boomed, "trying to cover their own failures by attacking a pillar of the community. A man who has done nothing but try to bring prosperity to Dust Haven." The jury nodded. Then Judge Harlan called, "Miss Eliza Hart to the stand." Eliza stood. She was clean, her hair pulled back in its severe bun. She wore the one good dress she had salvaged, now mended and pressed. She walked to the stand, her back straight, and took the oath. "Miss Hart," the judge said, "you have brought serious accusations. Begin." Eliza looked out, not at the jury, but at the faces of the town. She saw Mrs. Thorne and Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, in the back row, their faces a mixture of curiosity and scorn. "My name is Eliza Hart," she began, her voice clear and steady. It did not tremble. It did not plead. It simply stated, "I am 29 years old. I came to Dusthaven to work. I was dismissed from my position at the Mercantile, not for familiarity, as was rumored, but for discovering that Mr. Merrick's associate, Mr. Sipes, was stealing." A murmur went through the room. "I was then summoned," she continued, "to an event called the Prosperity Gala. It was not a gala. It was a public auction." "Objection!" Merrick's lawyer leaped to his feet. "This is slander. She is hysterical." "Overruled," Judge Harlan said, his eyes on Eliza. "Let the woman speak." "Mr. Jed Merrick," Eliza said, pointing a steady finger at him, "staged an auction for women who were hard to marry. I was the first lot. His auctioneer, Mr. Sipes, announced to the room that I was a trifle too old for a full nursery. He asked for a bid of $50. The room was stone silent. The women in the back row had gone pale. "Mr. Boone stopped this sale. For that act, Mr. Merrick sought to ruin him. He sent the Blacktooth Riders to ambush us on the trail. He hired men to destroy the common water station and poison the public opinion against Mr. Boone. He had his assistant, Mr. Barlow, plant dynamite at an Apache well. When we survived, he sent the riders to burn us out." Her voice was still level, a recitation of facts. "And when that failed," she said, her voice dropping, "he came himself. He kidnapped me. With the help of the burned man, Vance Crowe, he held me captive, trying to force Mr. Boone to sign over his water rights. And he led us all into the Devil's Fire Gorge. He was willing to see us all burn, himself included, to get that signature." She stopped. She looked directly at Jed Merrick. "The ledger we found is a record of his crimes, but I am the witness." Merrick's lawyer was on his feet, his face purple. "She is a liar, a fantasist. A woman scorned. She has no proof of any of this. It is the word of a spinster against a town builder. Is there any corroboration for this fantastic tale, Miss Hart?" the judge asked, his voice skeptical. "Yes," Eliza said. "I believe there is. The prosecution calls Mr. Barlow," Caleb's hired lawyer, a young, nervous man, said. The weedy bank assistant, Barlow, was brought in. He was shaking, his face the color of old paper. He looked at Merrick, who was staring at him, a look of pure, cold murder. "Mr. Barlow," the judge said, "you are under oath. Did you plant dynamite at the well on Mr. Merrick's orders?" Barlow looked at Merrick. He looked at Eliza. He closed his eyes. "Yes," he whispered, the word barely audible. He said it was just to protect the claim. He said Boone was a squatter. He gave me the dynamite. He and Sipes, they told me when the riders would attack. They planned it all." "And the gala?" the prosecutor asked. I heard them," a new voice said from the back of the courtroom. Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, was standing up, her hands twisting her bonnet. I was in Mr. Merrick's office for a fitting for his daughter. He did not know I was in the next room." "Mrs. Gable, you will come to the stand," the judge commanded. The seamstress, who had once come to condemn Eliza, now walked to the stand, her face a mask of shame and resolve. "I heard him," she said, her voice shaking but clear, directed at the jury. "I heard him and Mr. Sipes. They were laughing. Mr. Merrick said, 'The old hen is too proud. We will clip her wings. We will sell the too-old bride at auction.' I thought it was a terrible, crude joke. I did not know he meant it. Until just now." The jury looked at Merrick. He was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a man who had made a cruel joke at their expense. Judge Harlan had been looking through the ledger. He now closed it with a sharp, final thud. "This court," he said, "is not a fool. I was an engineer for the railroad for 20 years. I have seen books like this." He stood, his full height imposing. "This ledger is a clear and meticulous record of criminal conspiracy, price-fixing, and the hiring of known outlaws. The testimony of Mr. Barlow and Mrs. Gable corroborates the motive and the means." He pointed at Merrick. "The contracts you hold, based on loan sharking and intimidation, are null and void. The charter for the Dust Haven Bank is hereby suspended, pending federal investigation. Your assets, all of your assets, are seized by the territorial marshal to pay for the damages you have inflicted on Mr. Boone and on this territory." A collective gasp went through the room. Merrick was white. He was ruined. As the judge spoke, Eliza walked to the prosecutor's table. She picked up the cream-colored invitation to the Prosperity Gala. She walked to the witness stand, and in the dead silence, she tore the invitation in half, and then in quarters, and let the pieces fall. Her social chains broken. "It is over," Caleb whispered, his hand on her back. But it was not. Merrick let out a sound, a high-pitched, unhuman squeal of rage. He was a man of paper, and his world of paper had just burned. He did not have a gun. He lunged. He grabbed the nearest person, a shield. It was Barlow, who shrieked with terror. Merrick did not have a gun, but he had a small, sharp letter opener, pulled from his boot. He held it to Barlow's throat. "You will not take me," he screamed, his eyes rolling, spittle flying from his lips. "I am this town. You will let me go." The marshal raised his pistol. Caleb did not move. He had no clean shot. Eliza took one step forward. All eyes were on her. She did not look at the knife. She looked at Merrick's eyes.
"You are not afraid of them, Jed?"
she said, her voice as calm as it had been on the stand.
"You are afraid of me."
Merrick's head, which had been swiveling, locked onto her. "You," he hissed, the blade pressing into Barlow's skin. "You, which?" "You are terrified," Eliza said, taking another step. "Not of his gun." She nodded at Caleb. "Not of the judge. You are terrified that a woman you called too old and expired had a voice. You are afraid that I could read your ledger." She was at the foot of the dais, looking up at him. "You are not a builder. You are a thief, and you are afraid of a pen. Jed, not a gun."
I,
he stammered. "You have lost," she said. It was not a taunt. It was a fact. "And you lost to the old hen you tried to sell. Let him go." Merrick looked at her. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, damning pity. He looked at the blade in his hand. He looked at the faces in the courtroom, all staring at him, not with fear, but with contempt. His world of power, built on whispers and intimidation, had been undone by a single, clear voice. He let out a long, ragged sigh. The hand holding the letter opener trembled, and then it fell to his side. The blade clattered to the floor. Barlow stumbled away, sobbing. Jed Merrick, the man who owned everything, stood alone, his shoulders slumped, a small, pathetic, and utterly defeated man. The marshal stepped forward and put the cuffs on his wrists. Caleb let out a breath he did not know he was holding. He looked at Eliza, who was just standing there, watching Merrick be led away. She had not fired a shot. She had not thrown a punch. She had simply spoken the truth, and in this new, hard country. The truth, spoken by a woman who refused to be silent, had been the most powerful weapon of all. The exit from the courthouse was a silent, stunned procession. The crowd parted, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and a new, grudging respect. Jed Merrick was led away in irons, his face a gray, slack mask of ruin. He did not look at anyone. The pillar of the community had crumbled. and the dust was settling. News, carried on the telegraph wire and by riders eager to spread the tale, moved faster than the fire in the gorge had. The Blacktooth Riders, their paymaster gone and their leader a ghost, dissolved into the territory, a scattered band of cowards. As Caleb, Eliza, and Chayton stood on the courthouse steps, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, a man in a clean suit approached. He had sat in the back of the courtroom, an observer, and he had a notebook. "Mr. Boone," he said, tipping his hat. He had the brisk, impersonal air of the railroad. "My name is Silas Croft. I am a claims adjuster for the Union Pacific Line. Judge Harlan is an old friend." Caleb just nodded, his body tense, expecting another fight. "The judge telegraphed us when this trouble began. Your ranch, Mr. Boone, sits on a critical, pre-surveyed branch line. We have an interest in stability in this valley." He looked from the burned cuff of Caleb's shirt to the raw, red skin on Chayton's hands, and finally, to Eliza. "It seems we have you to thank for providing it." "What do you want?" Caleb asked, his voice rough. "To pay you," Mr. Croft said simply. "The fire, the destruction of your property. It was an act of local unrest on railroad interest land. Our insurance covers such inconveniences." He handed Caleb a slip of paper. "This is a draft, to be cashed at the bank in the capital, not Dust Haven. It should cover the rebuilding of your barns and your livestock. We, and the judge, would consider it a favor if you would stay. Mr. Boone, we find we prefer neighbors who are not so easily burned out." Caleb looked at the number on the paper. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was a foundation. They rode back to the ranch, 3 tired figures against a sunset that was, for once, peaceful. The next morning, a wagon appeared on the ridge, and then another. It was not a posse. It was Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, and her husband. Their wagon was loaded with new sawn lumber. She marched up to Eliza, her face set in a look of grim determination. "I cannot unsay what I said," Mrs. Gable began, not meeting Eliza's eye. "And I cannot unhear what Merrick said. But a woman who can face down fire and a courtroom should not be sleeping under a burned roof." She looked at the charred remains of the barn. "My husband will help Mr. Boone, and this," she shoved a bolt of dark blue, sturdy wool at Eliza, "is for a new dress, not for any other reason, just because a woman needs a good dress." More came. Mr. Hemlock, from the mercantile, arrived with 3 kegs of nails, coffee, and a quiet, shame-faced apology, offering to help with the ledgers. The men from the posse, the ones who had ridden with Merrick, came one by one, without their badges, offering their hands for the barn raising. It was not friendship. It was a frontier apology, built of sweat and shared labor. Even the common water station, the one the riders had destroyed, was rebuilt. The town men, led by Pete and Silas, worked alongside Caleb. It was Chayton who stood back, watching, until the new trough was set. He took his knife and, at the head of the new well, he began to carve. He did not carve a name. He carved 2 words into the raw, new wood, freedom, well. The ranch was loud with the sound of hammers and saws, a sound of healing. In the quiet of the evening, when the men were in the bunkhouse, Eliza found Chayton sitting on the porch, staring at his hands. The burns from the fire in the gorge were bad, the skin a weeping, angry red. He had refused all help. Eliza sat beside him, carrying a small bowl of her own pine salve and clean white bandages. "If you do not clean those," she said, her voice matter-of-fact, "you will lose the use of them." He looked at her, his eyes dark with a pain he would never speak of. He did not argue. He just held them out. She was gentle. She cleaned the burns, her touch as light as a breeze, yet as firm as her word. She applied the salve and wrapped his hands in the bandages. Her movements economical and kind. He sat like stone, his gaze on the far mountains. "The Apache well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is clear now. The railroad men, they cleared it. They say it is Boone's."
"It is ours,"
Eliza said softly, tying off the last bandage.
"For the water. It belongs to all who need it."
He looked at her then, a long, searching look, a flicker of a smile, so rare it was startling, touched his lips. You are a different kind of white woman, Eliza Hart." He looked at his bandaged hands, then nodded toward Caleb, who was standing at the new corral, watching the last of the foals she'd saved. "You think freedom is being alone." Chayton said, "It is not. A lone man is just a target." He flexed his bandaged fingers. "Sometimes, freedom is knowing how to say yes to the right person." He stood, gave her a nod of thanks, and walked into the cool darkness of the valley. Later, Eliza found Caleb on that same porch. The noise of the rebuilding was gone. The only sound was the wind, but it was a gentle wind now, carrying the scent of new-cut pine, not of smoke. The frame of the new barn was a stark, hopeful skeleton against the stars. Caleb was not looking at the barn. He was staring at his hands, as if expecting them to be empty. Eliza stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his.
"It will be a good barn,"
she said quietly. He did not look at her.
"It is just wood,"
he said, his voice thick.
"It is just things."
He turned to her, and in the starlight, she saw the old, deep fear in his eyes. The fear of the man who Belazov the desert wind took everything. I am not good at this," he stammered, the words forced out. The after, the part where things are not on fire." He took a deep, ragged breath. "I watched that barn burn, and I thought, of course, that is what happens. I watched Crow, and I thought, of course, and in the courtroom, I was waiting for the bullet." He finally met her eyes, his own full of a raw, desperate vulnerability. "I look at that new wood, Eliza, and all I can think is, what will take it this time? And I look at you, and I am terrified, because the wind, it always—" He could not finish. Eliza waited, letting the silence stretch.
"The wind is real, Caleb,"
she said, her voice as firm as the rock beneath their feet. "It is not just in your head. It took my husband. It took my job. It took my reputation. In that canyon, it almost took my life. It is a terrible, true thing." She took his hand. His was rough and calloused. Hers was scarred now, from the rope burn and the fire. "But I am not a barn," she said, her voice fierce. "I am not a horse you can lose. I am not something the wind can just take." She stepped closer, forcing him to look at her, to truly see her. "My freedom, the freedom you saved, is bigger than your fear. It has to be. It is big enough for both of us. The wind can do its worst. It does not matter, because I am not going anywhere." She laced her fingers with his.
"I choose,"
she whispered, reminding him of her words in the ash. "I choose to stand here, next to you." Caleb's hand tightened on hers. He did not speak. He just held on, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was always moving, always threatening to blow away. The ranch was quiet. Weeks had passed. The roof was on the new barn. The smell of pine had been replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of hay and horse. It was a warm night. From the bunkhouse, where Pete and Silas now lived, the thin, sweet sound of a fiddle being played badly drifted on the air. Caleb was on the porch, cleaning a piece of tack. He was awkward, his movements stiff. Eliza came out of the house, drying her hands on her apron. She had been going over the new ledgers. She stopped, and for a moment, they just stood there, in the comfortable silence they had built. Caleb put the harness down. He stood. He looked at his boots. He looked at the stars. He looked at her. I do not know how to do this, he said, his voice low, sounding almost embarrassed. This part, the quiet. He held out his hand, not for her to bind, not to pull her onto a horse, just held it out. Eliza, Eliza smiled, a small, real smile. She untied her apron, let it fall onto the chair, and placed her hand in his. He pulled her close, his movements clumsy. It was not a grand, romantic gesture. It was awkward and real. He was stiff. She was unused to it. He put his other hand on her waist, as if he were handling a wild colt, afraid it might bolt.
It is a waltz,
she whispered, guiding him.
Just 1, 2, 3.
There, on the rough wooden porch, under a sky so thick with stars it looked like spilled salt, they danced, a slow, shuffling waltz, to the sound of a bad fiddle and the quiet chirping of the crickets. He was not a good dancer. She was not wearing a ball gown. He smelled of leather and soap, and she smelled of bread and ink. He held her hand, the one he had bandaged, and she rested her head, just for a moment, against his shoulder, against the solid, steady beat of his heart. It was not a storybook ending. It was better. It was real. The wedding was not held in a church. There were no flowers, no organ music, and no pews filled with whispering guests. It was held at Freedom Well, the new-built common station, under a sky so vast and blue it hurt the eyes. The town was not invited, but they came. They stood at a distance, in their buggies and on their horses, watching. Mrs. Gable was there, and Mr. Hemlock, and even the deputy who had served the notice. They were not guests. They were witnesses, come to see the new shape of the world they now lived in. Eliza did not have a white dress. She wore her best blue work dress, the one Mrs. Gable had given her, scrubbed and pressed until it was spotless. Her hair was not in its severe bun. She wore it down, tied back with a simple leather thong. Caleb wore his one clean shirt, his face scrubbed, his hair slicked back with water. He looked uncomfortable and terrified and completely, stubbornly present. Pete and Silas stood as Caleb's men, their hats in their hands. Chayton Greyhawk did not stand. He sat on his pinto, his bandaged hands resting on the pommel. Beside him sat an old man, an Apache elder Chayton had brought from the high canyons, his face a map of 1,000 years. There was no preacher. The elder spoke, his voice like the wind passing over dry rock. He spoke in Ende, the word strange and old. Chayton translated, his voice low and clear. He asks if you have a promise. Chayton said. Caleb turned to Eliza. He had no ring. Instead, he took from his pocket 2 thin bracelets, braided with a clumsy, powerful hand. They were woven from the black and sorrel mane of the mare who had died in the fire. He took Eliza's hand, the one with the pale white scar from the rope burn. He did not ask. He simply slipped the first bracelet onto her wrist. I have no words for forever, Caleb said, his voice a rough whisper, meant only for her. I am a man of dust and bad luck, but I promise to work, I promise to listen, and I promise, his hand tightened on hers, to ride with you when the wind blows. Eliza looked at the bracelet. It was a promise of loss, and work, and survival. She took the second one from his hand. She took his, the one scarred from the cavalry saber and the fight with Crow. She slid the matching bracelet onto his wrist. I do not want forever, Eliza said, her voice clear, carrying on the quiet air. I want the truth. I promise to work. I promise to speak what is true. And I promise, she smiled, a small, real smile, to hold the reins when you are tired. The old man spoke again. He says it is done. Chayton said, he says you are one person now, like the mountain and the sky. He says, good hunting. Caleb turned to her. He did not kiss her. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, for the first time, the fear was gone. It was replaced by a quiet, steady light. The town, seeing the strange, plain ceremony was over, turned their wagons and rode slowly home. Mrs. Gable was dabbing her eyes. The future began the next day. It began not with a honeymoon, but with a ditch. The railroad money and the seized assets from Merrick's bank, administered by Judge Harlan, formed the new Dust Haven Valley Water Cooperative. Caleb, Eliza, and Chayton were on the board. Their first act was to dig an irrigation ditch from the Apache Well, not to the Boone Ranch, but to Freedom Well. It was a line of life, drawn across the dry valley. Caleb and Chayton worked the line, sighting the angles, while Pete and Silas, and now 3 other men, moved the earth. Eliza was not digging. She was in what had been Jed Merrick's office, at his fine, polished desk. The Dust Haven Bank was now the Water Co-op's office, and Eliza was in charge of the ledgers. All of them. She was not alone. Her first act had been to ride into town and knock on Mrs. Gable's door. "You have a head for numbers," Eliza had said, not asking, but stating. "I heard you in the courtroom. You know what things cost. I am hiring a bookkeeper. The pay is $2 a day." Mrs. Gable, whose seamstress shop was failing, had burst into tears. She was now at the adjoining desk, her needle-pricked fingers learning the sharp, clean edges of a ledger. Eliza had hired 2 other widows, women the town had dismissed as too old or unfortunate. She was not just giving them work, she was giving them power. The power of the pen, the power of the dollar. The town was changing. The whispers had not stopped, but their content had changed. They no longer talked of a woman's expiration date. They talked of crop yields. They talked of the price of water, which was now fair, and the same for everyone. The young girls, who had once been taught to aspire to a good match, now watched Eliza Hart number. Eliza Boone ride into town on her own horse, her head high, and they began to ask their fathers to teach them their letters and their sums. The past was not erased. It was not forgiven, not truly. You do not forgive a wildfire. You just rebuild on the ash, and you plant smarter. Merrick was in a territorial prison. Sipes was gone. The burned-out barn at the ranch was a reminder, a scar on the land. But scars, Eliza knew, were proof of healing. They were a sign that the worst was over, and you were still standing. The chain of shame, the humiliation that had been passed from man to man, from rumor to rumor, had been broken. It ended with her. It would not be passed to the next generation. The final scene was not an end. There are no ends. Not in the high country. There is only the next sunrise. It came, as it always did, in a flood of rose gold and fire, painting the high red cliffs. A herd of horses, the new foals now yearlings, ran in the lower pasture, their manes flying, their breath making steam in the cool morning air. Eliza rode beside Caleb. She was not on a side saddle, and she was not wearing a dress. She wore the trousers and shirt that gave her the freedom to move. They were riding the line, checking the new ditch. Caleb reined in, his gaze on the running herd. "They look strong," he said. "They are," Eliza said. She looked at him, at the man who had been a ghost of his own past, who now looked solid, real. His face turned toward the sun. He smiled, a slow, easy smile that was new, and that was all for her. "So do you." She did not need him to say it. She felt it. She was no longer a widow, no longer an outcast, no longer too old. She was a woman. She was a wife. She was the treasurer of the valley. She was Eliza Boone. She nudged her horse, breaking into a canter, and Caleb was right beside her. They rode into the sun, their hair flying in the wind, and her gaze, clear and steady, was on the horizon. She did not owe her glance to anyone. She was, at last, truly and completely free. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so glad you were here with me for this tale. I am curious. Where in the world are you listening from right now? Let me know in the comments. I would love to connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And if you really loved it, please hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks. I appreciate every one of you.